Welcome back. Authorities in China are bracing for the 20th anniversary of the deadly June the 4th crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square. And 2 decades later, should those protests be relegated to the history books, or are they still relevant today? Here with me in the studio is Dr. Yang Jianli, chairman of the Foundation for China in the 21st Century, a non-profit think tank promoting democracy in China and a veteran of the Tiananmen Square movement. He spent several years in prison on political charges and has testified to Congress on the events of that day. And from New York, we have Dr. John Delury, Associate Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations and Director of the China Boom Project at the Asia Society. Dr. Delury, a question from our internet, or comment, I guess, from our internet chat room, live station chat room, which you might want to comment on yourself. It comes from Sam in Canada, who says, in China, the big problem is trade conflict and less so human rights, except in remote areas.
That, you know, it depends on how you define these things. I don't think it's fair to just say human rights aren't a problem in China. I do think we need to continue to update our definition of human rights and what it means. You know, for example, now environmental problems have become so severe in China that it's not part of the discussion in 1989. But if you saw any kind of protest movement now that was like what happened in '89, I think environmental issues would play a key role in terms of this is an area where often you have gross violation of public wealth, public assets, and public health in making deals. And this is where trade, in a way, trade, economic interests, and human rights violations come together. You have poor control over, say, the local government. It makes a deal with a Chinese company or a foreign company to set up a factory. It forces the people off the land. It sells the land. Pockets the money either personally for the officials involved or for the local government's budget. And then there's no regulation, environmental regulation. You have huge public health issues, and then you don't have a legal system that really allows local residents to, say, sue after the fact when they suffer from whatever adverse effects it has. So that's an example of a human rights issue, an environmental issue, and ultimately a sort of trade and economic development issue, and it's a political issue. So I don't think you can just divide these things and say one is the important one and the other is not.
All right, well, New Zealand on the phone next, and Bart's on the line. Bart, what would you like to ask or say?
Yes, I'm one of the charter members of the Independent Federation of Chinese Students and Scholars that was founded just after Tiananmen Square in Chicago, and it's based in Washington, D.C. And at that time, there were scores of Chinese students from China that were involved in the pro-democracy movement. And I'm wondering, are there still scores of students involved in the pro-democracy movement that are studying in China? And if not, why?
Dr. Yang.
Yes. I was one of the founders of the Independent Federation of Chinese students and scholars. There are a lot of people got involved at that time, but a lot of people left the movement. Now we have much fewer people actually work to advance democracy on a daily basis. I think it's quite normal. People, you know, that's a quite unusual time right after the massacre, in the aftermath of the massacre. People got very emotional and take part in the movement. But, you know, everybody has his or her own career, you know, take a different direction in their life. So I think this is not in the normal time you know, I don't think a movement should involve so many people. Yeah.
Although, Dr. Yang, there are those who say that now the young generation in China is so busy, you know, listening on their cell phones and to their MP3 players that their interest in democracy and the democracy movement may be pretty much dampened. And a comment from our chat room here comes from Dean in the US, who says, would your democratic paradigm embrace or reject the economic liberalism in China today? And if so, how can economic liberalism be expressive of popular, that's to say, democratic values?
Yeah, that's a quite important issue, how the young generation look at the democracy movement, how, you know, what they demand, and how to look at the economic achievement of China in the past 20 years. I think the massacre created directly two universal psychological states. Okay. One is universal fear, another is universal cynicism. And you know, on the surface, you look at the student, the younger generation student, they seems not to care about political issues, only pursue for the material gain. But why? We should ask the question why. Because number one, fear. Talking about political issues, it's dangerous. And number two, the goals you want to achieve for democracy, for example, is impossible because the massacre. People think of a massacre, think anything you do is impossible. So the only thing they can do is focus their attention on the economic activity. Right. So we have to get into it. Just cannot, make a judgment on the surface.
Do you think, just a quick thought before I get back to Dr. John Delury, do you think that young Chinese people debate the issues? Do they think about it? Do they really pay attention to the democratic and sort of political issues?
Oh, of course. If you get online to see the debates going on nowadays among their internet users, younger generation, most of them are young generation Chinese people. So they are so interested about the social welfare issues, environmental issues, as John just talked about, and the incident like Deng Yujiao, Yang Jia, those very notorious violation of human rights incidents. No. So they're so care about that.
Well, Dr. Delury, a couple of questions here from you from our internet chat room. Well, one question here from Sean in the US who says, 20 years later, will China ever face reality and acknowledge what happened? And an email that came in from Stockholm from Adolfo Talapar, who says, ask the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans, democracy in China is an oxymoron. So I wonder, the cynicism that people obviously have about the potential for change, and then this question, do you feel it will ever change?
Well, let's see. There's a lot of interesting issues being raised here. Actually, if I could step back and first respond to this discussion about Chinese youth now, because it just gets me reflecting on some of my own experience. I spent a year studying at Peking University, which of course was one of the main universities. Actually, the history department at Peking University produced many of the leaders among the student movement, as Dr. Yang can discuss, and I studied there not too long ago and then stayed on to teach a bit there. So I had a lot of chance to spend time with students now, undergraduates and graduate students, and talk with them and talk very frankly in Chinese about their political views. And I think it's so much more complicated than the conventional story you hear that they're just out for themselves and out for their career. I mean, graduate students, for example, at Peking University are not looking at making a lot of money in their academic career. So you have to throw that argument right out from the bat. But they do have very complicated views about politics. My sense is that there's a pervasive view that China ultimately should become some kind of democracy. And this goes back to one of the earlier comments or questions, is Chinese democracy, what kind of apple will it taste like? I agree with Dr. Yang and apple's an apple, but I do think China has a very distinctive history and culture, political culture, social composition, and the sort of hopefully more liberalized polity that it creates is going to look different than the American or than the various European and around the world, different democratic systems that we have. But my sense of the young generation is that there's still quite a bit of idealism. They're very politically astute. They read the news and take in news in a way much more critically than I think the average American counterpart. So I still have a lot of hopes for this generation and the kind of political system that will eventually emerge in China. Now, this all goes back to the recent questions about June 4th. I don't know that directly focusing on 1989 and on June 4th, that's the way this is going to happen. And if I were a progressive young Chinese person, with all due respect to Dr. Yang, and I'd like to hear his views because he personally paid such a cost and was involved in an incredibly inspiring and important movement and moment in Chinese history. But strategically and almost philosophically, if I were a young progressive Chinese person now, I don't think I'd be focusing on a reversal of the verdict of 1989 as the way to push for change. I think I'd use social networking and use online organizing. I think I would focus on issues like the environment, like social justice, which is such a huge issue in China now, the gap between the rich and poor. I'll stop there.
I was going to say, let's get Dr. Yang to respond. We've just got about a minute and a little bit for you to respond to that idea that there is a different direction. And just out of interest, are you surprised that China shut down all the social networking, the Facebooks and Twitters in the run-up to the Tiananmen anniversary?
I'm not surprised. We quite familiar with the normal practice of Chinese authorities, so I'm not surprised. So I'm sympathetic to what John just said. To have a change in China, it takes a lot of work. Not only just a focus on June 4th, but why we focus on June 4th? Some people from the movement focus on June 4th. The reason is very clear, because we try to find a breakthrough. And anything can, we force Chinese government to signal. If the Chinese government was forced, I use maybe the wrong word, to the position to acknowledge that they have made a mistake 20 years ago and try to have a reversal of the verdict, that would send a signal to the whole world, especially Chinese people. Right. They want to change. Okay. So that will have a good result from it. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Yang and Dr. Delury, I want to thank you both for your contributions to this debate. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Riz.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. On the next show, US President Barack Obama will address the world's 1.5 billion Muslims, and among his challenges will be convincing the population that the US can be an honest broker between the Israelis and Palestinians. Can he make concrete achievements that will benefit both the US and the Muslim world? From me and the team, we'll see you next time.